I was told at the start that I would need a title, which I hadn't really thought of. So the kind of working title for this is Disaffection and Its Aftermath: How a New Conjuncture Feels. Okay, so this paper's been partly written in response to Larry and Jason's drafts, which they sort of gave to us a couple of weeks ago when I had barely started to think about this. Not as a reply as such, or as any attempt at a synthesis, but just as a way of drawing out and developing what seemed to be some important themes, bringing together some ideas around affective reproduction and around what we might call affectively informed conjunctural analysis, and putting them into practice in the analysis of some recent political phenomena. So I wrote most of this over a couple of days, hanging around in the park and in various cafes in the East Village in Manhattan, during what felt like the first really calm few days I'd experienced in months. Of course, the calmness had a lot to do with having dumped the kids on my partner for 10 days. So don't worry, she's been away more than I have this year. We've counted the days and she's definitely winning. So it was that and the general sense of unreality which the combination of jet lag and weird carbon-induced warm weather tend to create. But the calmness was also because I was, for the first time, thousands of miles away from the intense political excitement that's gripped the British left in recent months. Excitement, inchoate, undirected, uncodified stimulation of the nervous and endocrine system, of the collective assemblages which countless such systems make in relation to each other and to the various machines, bodies, and institutions with which they interact, is perhaps the affect par excellence, affect in its rawest state, before it has even yet been recognized as sad or joyous, or taken on any emotional hue. Excitement, capable of transmuting equally quickly into panic, elation, tears, terror, or despondency, depending on the precise configuration and direction of dispositions and elements in play, is pretty much the only way of describing the reaction of both the political establishment, including the mainstream left-of-centre media, and the various components of the left to the most singularly unexpected political event of my lifetime, or at least perhaps since the Falklands War, the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. It's the main left-of-centre party in Britain. Now, before I explain a little bit about what these words might mean for the benefit of the vast majority of you who have no particular reason to need to know, let me explain. I'm not going to be talking about political events in the UK for their own sake, so you don't have to pretend to care about them. You have your own problems, I know. Rather, I'll be looking at some of their notable features as examples of the kind of phenomenon which a well-thought-out theory of affect can shed unique light on, and which demand and call for, I think, an effective analysis, if not indeed an effective politics, if that phrase can mean anything, if any politics could ever not be affective, which of course it couldn't. So here's the story. Until several months ago, the British Labour Party, like most socialist and social democratic parties outside of Latin America, and indeed like most political parties of any political complexion, was widely perceived as institutionally moribund, a vehicle for the reproduction of one section of the professional political class, which had lost almost all organic connection with its historic social bases, either in local communities or in the labour movement. In fact, it wasn't just widely perceived as such, it was that. Senior figures in the party were reliably rumoured to have confessed privately that they didn't think it could be saved as a vehicle for democratic or progressive politics. Now, very few had given any thought to the implications of a change in the rules governing the election of the party leader, which had been made during Ed Miliband's 5-year tenure, a very unsuccessful tenure as party leader, a tenure which ended with Labour's catastrophic defeat at the general election of May this year. That rule change dispensed with the pre-existing system which gave labour unions, members of parliament, the national legislature, and ordinary party members each 1/3 of the vote in an electoral college. Replacing that system with a one-member, one-vote system and introducing a new category of registered supporters as distinct from full party members who could participate in the election on equal terms with members in return for a very modest registration fee. Now, this new system had been enthusiastically welcomed by the neoliberal wing of the party and its iconic figure Tony Blair, whose love of all things American had long since led them to believe and to assume that moving as close as possible to an American-style system of open primaries, rather than confining party elections to party members, which is what happens in most countries, would weaken even further the influence of the trade unions in the party and would prevent party activists, whom the Blairites had always hated as a point of principle, from ever again recovering any influence over policy or candidate selection. The new system nonetheless retained the principle that a potential leadership candidate must be nominated by a certain number of members of parliament. The first 4 candidates to cross the necessary threshold were all very much members of the established professional political class. And as a result, there was a general anxiety that the established tradition of a no-hope candidate from the residual radical left of the party, participating in all the debates, creating an illusion of inclusiveness and true democracy, would be broken, exposing just how tedious and socially homogenous, how fully integrated into the sort of national professional political class the Labour leadership and parliamentary party had become. So in order to prevent this, a move to find enough nominations among members of parliament for a radical left candidate saw support coming from some prominent Blairite figures, lavishly displaying their commitment to openness and debate by nominating the absolutely no-hope lifelong Marxist MP, Jeremy Corbyn. Imagine a system in which presidential candidates have to be nominated by senior party figures and John Kerry nominates Bernie Sanders just so there can be a bit of spectacle to the proceedings, and Hillary thinks this is fine because he hasn't got a hope, and you get the picture. And then 300,000 people joined the party or registered as supporters, and Jeremy Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party. The Blairites and their allies in the press looked on helpless. It's hard to convey to anyone from outside the UK how utterly surreal the words Jeremy Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party still sound coming out of my mouth. I've been explaining to French friends that it's as if Trotskyist mailman Olivier Besancenot had been elected leader of the PS, except it's weirder than that, because that would be France. Even if Bernie Sanders actually gets the Democratic presidential nomination, people in the States will have had far longer to get used to the idea than the 3 months during which the idea of Corbyn as Labour leader went from being a joke to becoming an actualised reality. Well, I'm a seasoned, lifelong and cynical, like Larry, political activist, but I have very few friends who did not, like me, shed tears when we saw this happen on September 15th. We wept for something we would never have dared to dream of. We wept for the comrades who died too soon to see it happen. We didn't care. We know damn well that Corbyn's chances of actually winning a general election are at best remote. Still, we wept tears of hot, happy rage to see the smug, venal, incompetent Blairites finally find out what it felt like to lose. And let me tell you, they don't like it at all. The panic, the rage and petulance have been and remain staggering to behold. And nobody really has a clue where any of this is heading right now. Most people don't even know how to feel, really, never mind what to think. What there is a great deal of excitement. Now this, I think, is what the end of one conjuncture and the beginning of a new one must feel like. Corbynism might just represent the final death throes of the British left. It might be that this obscure figure from the extreme wing can never build a winning coalition and will only confirm the unelectability of the party for at least a generation. But that's what they said about Margaret Thatcher when she was elected Conservative leader in 1975. Well, a lot of people did. Either way, something has ended and something else is starting up. Elsewhere, I've called this experience of apparent conjunctural shift to the end of the long 90s. Although if we end up with another Clinton in the White House, it may be too early to call time on the long 90s. Either way, nobody saw this coming, which is the real point of departure for my analysis here today. I'm not going to try to make any predictions or offer any immediate analysis of the situation. I can do that all night if you want, trust me, but it's not what we're here for now. What I want to do instead is to share some observations about recent phenomena that might arguably have offered some clue that such an epochal event was about to occur. I commented shortly after the Tory election victory of this year, which was predicted by not one single pollster in the months leading up to the event, that if we had paid more attention to the general mood of the country, to the prevalent pessimistic, conservative and individualistic structures of feeling, then we would never have been fooled by the polls into expecting, as most did, a Labour government. So when thinking about this paper for today, I found myself groping around in the recent past for anything I'd noticed happening that might have prefigured some such epochal upsurge for the radical left. Now, what I found was perhaps surprising, but I want to contend highly relevant. Now, I have to apologise for the almost wholly anecdotal nature of what follows. When I was younger, I used to hate this. Some guy giving a keynote basically about some conversation he had on the bus. So, sorry, younger me. Sorry, everyone. So it doesn't prove anything in itself, but it's interesting and it's suggestive nonetheless. What I found fumbling around in my recent memory was a recollection of an interesting observation I'd made about the general disposition of my students in relation to certain hegemonic norms in recent years. Specifically, I'd commented to a couple of colleagues on the changing ways in which students were responding to the thesis put forward by Angela McRobbie in her 2008 book, The Aftermath of Feminism, according to which young women in cultures shaped by advanced neoliberalism found themselves offered what McRobbie called a new sexual contract. The terms of this contract are familiar to many of us. Women will be offered access to education and the labour market on equal terms with men, and will be granted a degree of sexual freedom, which is not historically typical, provided they subject themselves to very rigorous forms of self-monitoring, and in order to conform as far as possible to largely highly sexualized modes of self-presentation, and as long as they don't expect anyone to help them if and when they become mothers. The fictional poster girl for the new sexual contract, as McRobbie argued, was Sex and the City heroine Carrie Bradshaw. Now, I'd been teaching this book basically since the week it came out, and I'd always asked my students, especially the women among them, if McRobbie's account resonated with their experience of contemporary femininity, especially in the labour market. Now, for the first couple of years, say 2008, 2009, maybe also 2010, the response from those students was always the same. Yes, that's exactly what it's like. That's just how it is. They absolutely recognise themselves as parties to a contract whose terms they did not approve of, but which they experienced as unchallengeable, except by way of very direct and deliberate and inherently isolated symbolic resistance. From around 2011, however, once the cohorts I was teaching were made up of students who had spent their entire time at college in the post-financial crisis period, the answers started to be different, although equally consistent and intriguingly complicated. It kind of used to be like that, they would say. When I was at school, it seemed to be that way. Now the pressure isn't the same. It might be like that in some jobs still. It was like that for people my sister's age. I don't think it's quite the same for us, etc. This wasn't a new feminist militancy being expressed, so much as a sense that the power and authority of certain norms had weakened. Vaguely, yet decisively. A bit of further discussion generally led to an interesting conclusion that the real site at which those norms had been most strictly enforced on young women was indeed in key sections of the labour market, retail, commercial media, finance, and that the declining capacity of the financial and corporate elite to extend employment opportunities in those sectors to students and graduates was one of the key reasons why both the attractive force and the social authority of the norms which radiated from those centres seemed to have dramatically declined. In the useful terminology put forward by Frédéric Loudon, whom Jason has already referred, that elite had lost much of its power to enlist subjects in its projects by way of its capacity to offer gainful employment. And it was precisely this weakening capacity of existing elites to enlist the capacities and energy of young subjects, which seemed to be being registered in my discussions with students about the waning force of the new sexual contract in the period 2011 to 14. And it's this, I think, that might have pointed the way towards a possible eruption in the political landscape in the year to come. So I'm taking this as an example of a phenomenon which could only really be registered in affective terms. It wasn't about identifications. My students had never identified with the new sexual contract. It wasn't about clearly defined identities or political orientations. It was about a change of mood, a shift in the way things felt, which was irreducibly bound up with a loosening of certain constraints as the power of one group waned, allowing another to experience a tentative enhancement in their own capacities to act, even if they were as yet unsure as to what expressing that power might involve. Now, the question which emerges here then is, what more might we need to do in order adequately to theorise this situation and its parameters? So can you just pass me a cup of water? Thanks. So as I suggested, Laudon's notion of affective enlistment is clearly very useful for thinking about what wasn't able to happen as this situation unfolded. But I think I'm being rather generous to Laudon here. Jason, I'm not having a go at you. I'm going to have a go at Laudon now, a bit. But he's a Laudon guy. But I think Laudon is really useful. I think he's extremely interesting. I'll explain why in a minute. But I think he has very little to say about let me get it. Okay, I'm being rather generous. What I'm referring to is a situation here in which a certain kind of authority is exercised by an elite, primarily by virtue of their economic power, but may well be experienced primarily as influence over the spheres of consumption, leisure, and everyday life, rather than just the sphere of work. Laudon, on the other hand, has very little to say about these spheres, or the ways in which processes of enlistment may operate through them. So, okay, I'll just come out and say it. Laudon for me, has no real grasp of the complex nature of hegemony. Something which his entire project seems to be screaming out for. I mean, really, come on. What can be said about his book Willing Slaves of Capital, which worries explicitly, in exactly these terms, on pretty much every other page, about the relationship between domination and consent, those are the exact terms, and yet in which the name of Antonio Gramsci does not appear even once. I mean, clearly Laudon's got a kind of agenda there, which I don't really understand, but one can say that it has some holes in the bibliography at least. More fundamentally, we can say these holes leave Laudon unable to say much, and also give a very convincing account, I think, of how consent, which is the term he uses over and over again, actually works in contemporary neoliberal culture. Now, there's no question. I'm saying this because it's convenient to me rhetorically. I mean, the Laudon book is brilliant, and I recommend everybody to read it. And there's no question that he does us a great service in pointing out the centrality of affect, the reproductive processes he's concerned with, especially because he does so in terms which are often clear and comprehensible to someone who has not spent 10 years wading through capitalism and schizophrenia, because of his exclusive reliance on Spinoza as his only real theoretical source. On the other hand, I think Laudon's model of how affective power relations actually work in contemporary culture is quite simplistic. Laudon absolutely brilliantly points out the ways in which contemporary employment practices seek to enlist the full affective potency of every worker by demanding a certain passionate engagement in work and with work and corporate institutions. And while he is obviously aware that this process of recruitment can never, or can only rarely, be fully successful, I think he does nonetheless assert, or at least imply at numerous points in his argument, that it generally is successful. The workers become enthusiastic participants in the process of accumulation which exploits them, and that this is how consent to that exploitation and to neoliberal domination are secured. Now, I have to say, this just isn't my observation as to how neoliberal hegemony works, either in France or the UK. You can have a different argument about the States. Rather, I think the most cursory attention to data, such as public opinion surveys, makes quite clear that one of the notable features of neoliberal hegemony is that it has never been secured on the basis of active consent. Most people have never supported the privatizations, the regressive tax policies, or the anti-union legislation, which have characterized the neoliberal program in many countries. As I say, the data on the US is more complicated, but the US is an exceptional case with regard to the so-called democracies of the so-called developed world. Rather, people have tended to support governments who pursued these policies largely on the basis of a belief that no viable political alternative was available, and on the basis of an implicit understanding that despite the socially regrettable consequences of neoliberalism, it would at least continue to enable consumption to carry on at historically unprecedented levels. So the resultant disposition towards hegemonic neoliberalism is one I've called disaffected consent. It's a variation of passive consent, as described by Gramsci, and it's a phenomenon which doesn't really seem to be allowed that much by Laudon's schema, within which consent always seems to be active. I think it's a useful way of describing the relationship of the earlier groups of students to whom I was referring to the general situation of neoliberal hegemony, which they experienced immediately as a pressure to modify their behaviour in a process typical of what Laudon calls alignment or enlistment, or alignment or enlistment, which is designed to engender what he calls collinearity between the desires of the dominant and the dominated. It's a great phrase, collinearity, between the desires of the dominant and the dominated. But what I think is sort of different from the situation I was observing from the ones as Laudon describes is that this process, this production of collinearity, wasn't accompanied by the inspiration of genuine loyalty or passionate engagement on the part of these subjects in relation to the processes that they were engaged in. In fact, the opposite was the case. It was clearly the absence of an alternative, in particular the absence of a collectively available, politically viable and effectively engaging alternative, which obliged consent to a position of subordination, in return for which at least a historically unusual level of personal autonomy and private consumption would be on offer, at least before the crisis of 2008. And this, I would contend, was only ever one localised manifestation of that disaffected consent to neoliberal hegemony, which was widely typical of the relation to hegemonic neoliberalisation of many important populations in many different countries around the world, and at least until quite recently. I got this whole spiel about the relationship between disaffected consent and cruel optimism, but we haven't really got time. You'll have to trust me, it's really good. So what do I actually mean by this term disaffected consent? Well, I don't exactly know, to be honest. I've been using it for a few years, and quite a few people have picked up on it. I first used it in a conference paper at a conference with Larry, actually, and I didn't think much of it, but other people kept encouraging me to come back to it. So I wrote a paper on disaffected consent for a conference in Paris that Laudon was at, actually, and learned in the process that there is really no translation of disaffected into French. They use désabusé, which really means disillusioned, disenchanted. So I admit this is a tentative and experimental foray into thinking about why the term seems to resonate. The term disaffected is one that I think has some interesting implications. Most dictionaries seem to just treat it as a synonym for dissatisfaction. But I think in actual usage, it carries a slightly different resonance, specifically connoting a certain waning of affective intensity, of connectivity and potency. Obviously, there's a relationship between disaffection, so conceived, and the Spinozian notion of the sad affect, which indexes a diminution of the body's capacity to act. At the same time, I would always want to read this notion of sad affect through the lens of John Protavi's Deleuzian interpretation, according to which such a diminution of the body's capacity to act is always necessarily a reduction of whatever body's capacity for productive relations with other bodies. The term disaffection, I think, captures very nicely a condition in which sad affects are bound up with a general reduction of positive intensity and connective potential. And my general contention would be that historically, it's often, not always, I'm not saying always, though through precisely the promotion of certain kinds of disaffection thus conceived, that neoliberal hegemony has been secured. That's to say, it's been maintained not so much through the positive mobilisation of actual support for neoliberal policies, except among specific, strategically important populations, as through mechanisms which work to disaggregate any possible sense of collective agency and democratic potency. In the education sector, for example, it's not as if actual neoliberal ideas are often compulsory elements of curricula, but the aggressively and carefully engineered marketisation of social relations in sectors such as education creates a situation in which the affective experience of participating in them is characterised less and less by any sense of collective becoming, and more by one of disaggregation and individualisation, such that the agency is only ever experienced as an individual property, and other participants are experienced primarily as competitors for scarce resources. In fact, at its most extreme, the ideal consequence of these operations is a situation in which the ontological fact of trans individuality, which I sort of share a commitment to with Jason, itself comes to be experienced as a problem, which is partly why trans individuality is such a crucial political idea right now. Trans individuality comes to be experienced as a problem. I'd say that's the ultimate goal of the neoliberal assemblage, really. In particular, let's recall here that affect is always to be understood as a capacity both to affect and be affected, and reflect that the ideal neoliberal subject is indeed not possessed of the capacity easily to be affected. This isn't just a generic cultural observation, although we all know that the ideal neoliberal subject is too driven by self-interest, really, to be motivated by any kind of transversal relations. It's also a key element in those political traditions such as public choice theory, which have done so much to influence and shape actually existing neoliberalism. At the most extreme, such currents of thought take the view that, for example, any form of collective deliberation is inimical to effective group decision-making. I mean, seriously, when the neoliberals write about democracy, this is the kind of thing they say, the public choice theory. They said if you can't get people in a room and let them talk to each other, you've got to separate them, because otherwise they'll just influence each other. And time and again, it's the breakdown of those types of mechanisms which seems to enable something new to emerge by way of radical and democratic mobilisations. Now, if I refer this remark back to the events which I began the paper talking about, it was partly the weakening of neoliberal hegemony which seems to have made possible an arguably unprecedented surge of political radicalism in the UK in recent months. But it was also a growing sense of shared potential enabled by a range of recent developments on multiple geographical and technical scales. The defiance and inventiveness shown by voters and activists in Greece, Spain and Scotland was part of it, and certainly constituted a source of affective contagion for the emergent Corbynista multitude. At the same time, the capacity for cross-generational self-organisation which social media have enabled played an absolutely crucial role. I mean, you should see how scared the Blairites have been by this, actually, the fact they no longer have a monopoly on the channels of communication. What played a far less important role, I'd suggest, was anger at the suffering inflicted by the government's austerity programme, or by the long-term consequences of decades of neoliberal government. Those should have been key mobilising factors, according to conventional understandings of what should provoke radical mobilisation, but in reality they weren't. Now, this set of observations converges on a particular hypothesis which I'd like to present, which I think has significant implications in a range of different domains, and which I think is absolutely consistent with the theories of affect as they've been developed by some of the great thinkers speaking at this conference today, and with some of the key sources on which they've drawn. The hypothesis is simply this: the experience of oppression as such is not what mobilises. All mobilisations are provoked, rather, by an experience of collective potency, however subtle, momentary, molecular, or slight. The felt, palpably sensed weakening power of the neoliberal elite is what conveyed to my students a new sense of open possibility for young women and their modes of becoming, which a mere consciousness of their exploitation and confinement wasn't able to lend to the cohorts which immediately preceded them. The banality of Obama's original election slogan is echoed directly in the name of arguably the most radical and dangerous new political force in Europe, Spain's Podemos party, whose name translates directly as "we can." In my experience, it's not merely the pain of police violence which provokes, for example, collective expressions of anger on the part of young black people on the streets of London. That violence is experienced day in, day out, year in, year out. Rather, it's those moments when it becomes apparent, affectively, for this is rarely ever articulated explicitly, that such violence is itself an expression of fear on the part of institutions whose anxiety at the imminent power of such communities is almost its defining characteristic. It's the moment when the kids realise the cops are scared of them that something really happens. In fact, in all honesty, I think this is the greatest lesson we can draw from the theory and theories of affect as they've been developed over recent years, and in some cases centuries. The lesson that all progressive mobilisation derives from experiences which at least partially carry with them the experience of trans individuality as a source of potency and creative possibility. In other words, an experience of collective joy, and joy as collectivity, as trans individuality. when it is known as such, which might be a good way of describing the experience of love, but there isn't time to get into that here. If the theory of affect, which is always the theory of power, and always the theory of collectivity, and always a refutation of individualist assumptions, and always a theory of joy, teaches us nothing else, then this is possibly enough. Have I got 5 minutes? All right. I thought I might have to stop there, but I'll do the... Right, okay. That was my potential closing flourish, but there's another bit. Sit tight. So there are important questions which persist here, however. In particular, what exactly, or even vaguely, are the modes of commonality which can or must be activated in order to make such mobilisation possible? In what, if anything, are they grounded? To put this very crudely, I suggest there are two broad families of answers to this question. On the one hand, there are those which would stress the centrality of shared interests to political mobilisation. On the other hand, there are those which would focus on the fundamental importance of shared identities and identifications as necessary features of any mobilised collectivity. Now, obviously, both of these families of answers have a degree of explanatory power, and in any real situation, complex interactions between interest and identification are in play. But I want to suggest, I might be wrong about, there might be a whole literature I've missed here, so there is, just tell me, because I haven't really started working on this yet. But I'm going to suggest the theorisation of interests, the understanding of what interests are and how they operate, lags way behind the theorisation of identity in recent radical theory. It should be pretty much self-evident, I hope, that any meaningful understanding of politics and power relations, must be oriented at least in part by an understanding that politics is about the promotion of some interests at the expense of others. The great myth of liberal politics, of course, is that this is not the case. That politics can instead be a question of simply reasonably working out a situation which is good for everybody involved, helping capitalism to produce the goods while understanding all of the collateral damage as incidental and contingent. Marxism is nothing if not a theory of interests, and of the ultimate irreconcilability of the class interests of labour and capital. However, I think that one of the consequences of the move away, decades ago now, from Marxism and class politics, the key frame for thinking any real radical politics, and of the critique of all forms of essentialism since the 1980s, has been that a rejection of a simplistic notion of class interest has led to a real under-theorisation and under-deployment of the category of interest at all. Even in some of the most highly developed and sophisticated political theory, such as the work of Leclau and Mouffe, a certain kind of psychoanalytic orientation has tended to allow the implicit assumption that politics is fundamentally nothing but a struggle for identity and over identities to develop. I think it's notable, therefore, that within the general field of what this conference designates affect theory, the notion of interest has cropped up once again in explicit terms in some of the most recent work by people like Ballant and Masumi. And I think this is highly suggestive, because affect theory, if there is such a thing, sorry, Debbie, I'm pretending there is, it does, I'm going to suggest, furnish us with some useful tools with which to formulate a sophisticated understanding of interests. And Laudon has a whole book about interest, which is okay. So what are interests? What do we mean when we say, following a critical tradition which runs from pre-Marxian radicalism, I'm on the last page, to Laurent Ballant's cruel optimism, that people are persuaded to act or even to desire against their own interests? What are those interests? On the one hand, of course, there's a tradition of trying to measure such interests in purely private and economistic terms, but nobody in the radical tradition has ever really taken that seriously. Interests are always, in some sense, a question of potentialities, of hypothetical but not necessarily realised possibilities, of the capacity to flourish in as complex and multivalent a way as possible, being enabled or denied to persons, communities, assemblages, whatever. What my students sensed before and after the neoliberal elite's precipitous loss of authority was a set of constraints and a set of possibilities, which is experienced not in terms of any particular shared identity as women, as young women, as workers, as feminists or potential feminists, but as the bundle of possible vectors of becoming, lines of flight no less, which remained merely virtual, unactualisable and unrealisable in the moment of full neoliberal hegemony, but which became at least actualisable as really comprehensible possibilities at the moment of its waning. That's not to say that these possibilities were necessarily realised in that moment, but they were at least, I would suggest, actualised as possible sets of political cultural demands. From this perspective then, interests could be conceived as virtual bundles of non-denumerable affective potentialities. You all got that? I'll say it again. Interests are virtual bundles of non-denumerable affective potentialities. Feel free to use it at parties. In fact, virtual and affective are probably tautologies here. We could just say they're non-denumerable bundles of potentialities or their multiplicity. I'd also suggest that demands can be defined precisely as actualised but not realised interests, but that's really for another paper. Interests so conceived are never private. They are always implicit in the creative and productive potential of a given set of relationships. In Simondon's terms, they exist in the domain of the pre-individual. And as such, they can rarely be accurately calculated, but they can be sensed. I'd go so far as to suggest that they can be, and often are, sensed in situations in which no singular or even composite identity exists which can effectively name, totalise, facialise, in Deleuze and Guattari's terms, them, or tie them to a particular programmatic agenda. To refer to the examples I've given, they were sensed by the students in my seminar as the conjunctural elements shifted. They were sensed by the hundreds of thousands who swarmed into the Labour Party this summer without any clear plan or objective. At the same time, the mountains of scientific evidence on the relationship between feelings of power, freedom and connectedness and the measurable levels of key mood-related hormones, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, oxytocin, makes clear enough that affect and affectivity are inseparable from questions of interest in the most concrete socio-biological terms. You can look out for my book on this, Endocrinal Culture, coming out sometime in the 2030s. In Laudon's terms, all political struggle is essentially a struggle for joy. I suppose what I want to add to this is a suggestion that all political struggle is joy of a certain kind, and without joy, at least a little bit, in the purely technical Spinozan sense, there can be no democratic mobilisation whatsoever. And this then is another reason why attention to affect is so very important. Larry, put your fingers in your ears, I'm going to fetishise affect, big time. If affect is the primary dimension of experience within which the matter of what collective bodies can do is contested, then it's a key site, perhaps the key site, at which interests are expressed, articulated and challenged. As such, it should not be seen as merely an object of specialist concern, the focus of some exotic but largely frivolous theorisation. Rather, it should be understood as the very substance of politics itself.